When you fill a chapter with dense panels, moving quickly through a story and not spending much time on action, how do you make it read smoothly? How do you use good paneling in spite of the lack of space? And most importantly, how do I find things to analyze and talk about? Luckily, Oda's got more tricks up his sleeve than you might realize. I promise you we will get to talking about that big page of Whitebeard and everyone else very soon, but we have a few things to talk about first. Look at the second to last page of chapter 1096, for example. This page is designed as a sequence of discrete events rather than any continuous motion, but it's easy to follow because each panel shows what the next panel is going to use. The first panel sets up the wood, so we can see them selling it in the next panel, which sets up the bullies, so we can see them attacking Kuma in the third panel. That's followed up by Ginny punishing the bullies, which is followed up by their pain, which is followed up by Kuma pushing away that pain. It finishes up with their gratitude and Kuma's joy at being able to help them. Each concept is the natural next step after the one before, never skipping so much that we lose track of what happened, but never repeating ideas unnecessarily. This kind of flow of concepts, of careful choices of what to show, is hard to notice, yet something that Oda does incredibly well, and frankly it's something I still want to understand a lot better so I can understand why certain sequences in manga read so well. Now jumping back to earlier in the chapter, Oda uses his typical establishing shots in an interesting way. Normally, shots like this are used to give the reader an idea of where something occurs, so we have this God Valley shot to establish that we're jumping back to events on the island. The fact that these islands have such distinct imagery, the two peaks of God Valley and the skull for Hachinosu Island, makes it easier to immediately recognize places, and that's very important in an arc like this where we're constantly jumping from place to place, we're not just focusing on Egghead. That's also why Egghead has such a distinct design, whereas past islands like Dressrosa or Wano didn't really have distinct shapes from the outside like this because we weren't jumping around in the same way. But the interesting thing is that we don't actually have a long sequence of things that happen on Hachinosu Island. Instead, most of what we get is this big panel of the island itself, and that's because all we really need to understand is that it's pirates talking on the pirate island. And we can get away with that because the imagery is so distinct. If Hachinosu Island didn't have an incredibly memorable design, then we would need a longer sequence of characters that we don't actually need to spend time on just to establish that this is a pirate island. Having memorable imagery allows you to get away with things that you wouldn't be able to normally. The bottom panel on this page uses a technique that shows up a few times in this chapter, including on some pages I won't talk about. The ordinary people are placed in the foreground, such that we can see the pain they experience and the anguish on their faces, while the celestial dragons are far in the background, so far that we can't even really see their faces. This makes it so we don't really empathize with them. It makes them feel inhuman, which matches the reprehensible actions they're taking. The page that introduces the Rock's pirate crew does some clever things in how it shows them, but before we can even get to that, it's a great example of how to build up to a reveal. Like in the first page we talked about, every panel has a purpose and is showing something different. First, we see a marine ship being attacked, then we have the marine reaction to that. The marine is looking, and so first we see a zoomed-in part of what he sees that hints at the larger reveal of the ship itself. We then see the marine intent to attack, the attack itself starting, and then the attack landing. There's a rhythm to this whole sequence, back and forth between Marines and pirates. We need to have panels of the Marines reacting and making their decisions, so it feels two-sided. But the difference in power is shown between how small the Marine panels are and how large the pirate panels are. There's a slow buildup of concepts before we actually get to see the crew. The Marines are attacked. Who attacked them? Is it Rocks? Yes, it is Rocks. We then get the Marine response and that attack hitting the Rocks pirates so that it can be something that the Rocks pirates respond to, instead of them just showing up on its own with nothing to set that up. Them appearing has more impact because it contrasts the way they were just attacked. This entire set of 2 pages also hard commits to having the Marines on the right and the pirates on the left, each facing each other, but the pirates clearly with the more dominant position on the page. The wide panel of the whole crew is one of those that doesn't really need to be read in a specific order. There are so many notable people in here that your eyes can really just explore it. If you do read the top row of speech bubbles first, then your eye gets drawn down by all these notable faces straight to the next row of speech bubbles. but the conversation is deliberately divided into separate threads. If you jump down from Stussie's remark to Gloriosa's response, you aren't missing anything with what Kaido, Linlin, and Shiki talk about, and if you read their conversation first, it doesn't really spoil anything from this conversation. The panel sizes in the bottom half of the page are very deliberate, and as Oda often does, it uses size to convey power and importance. Whitebeard subtly gets a wider panel than anybody else, because he's the figure of the most importance and power. The other two future emperors, and Shiki, who is strong enough to be a rival of Roger, get good-sized panels as well, while the rest are unimportant enough that they only get smaller panels. This is also a case of what I called one-by-one paneling in my Chapter 1000 video. While we do see most of these pirates in the wide shot, by singling each one out in their individual panels, we emphasize that each one does have individual importance. There's no one we can ignore, there's no one we can skip. This page as a whole also shows the nature of the Rocks Pirates. It's a group you would never expect to work together, so the fact that we get a shot of them all together actually working together shows the remarkability of their unlikely alliance. But at the same time, they still do clash and disagree and don't really get along, and that's why we have individual panels of each that still establish them as remarkably separate. The page that introduces Roger doesn't have as much going on, but that's part of the point. The Rocks Pirates are waging war, they are attacking ships directly, and so we had a whole page where the entire dynamic was defined by the clashing of two sides. Roger is willing to sneak in under everybody's noses, just as he would someday sneak into Big Mom's territory to steal a copy of her road poneglyph, so this is very in character for him. The Rocks Pirates were all facing to the right, while the Roger Pirates are facing to the left, and this doesn't just show how they're coming at the island from a different angle, but also how they operate on different wavelengths. But my favorite detail here is how small Ivankov and Kuma are under everything else. While all these strong fighters are clashing, the two actual protagonists of this sequence are under their noses, sneaking around like mice, forgotten underneath the flash of what's above them. A longer version of this flashback would be able to give us a sequence of these two sneaking around, having a whole Metal Gear Solid experience, but that's not the One Piece we're getting anymore. But it still makes sure to convey the feeling of them sneaking around through how this page is composed. The fact that all these major figures are distracting us to look at them makes it easy to forget about what these little guys down here are doing. Unfortunately, that relatively tight shot of them was set up for an ambush as something comes in from off-panel that we couldn't see from the camera angle we were at. The fact that we see Ivankov being attacked before we see the person attacking him conveys that ambush feeling. It feels like along with Ivankov, we're experiencing the feeling of being smashed against the wall before we even process that there's a person doing it to us. I also like the focus on hands here. This panel of a hand reaching out towards Kuma is not the most unique, and I think we've seen One Piece use it before. I'm pretty sure it happened with some Momo and Kaido flashbacks. But it ties into how Ivankov was attacked with a hand as well. This isn't just the generic idea of a hand grabbing someone, it's Kuma fearing what he just saw happen to his friend. The final sequence on this page shouldn't work, but it does anyway. Kuma is running to the left, but when he's knocked back by Saturn, he's also being knocked back to the left, and that implies that before that attack happened, he was running to the right. This means we have completely flipped camera angle in this sequence, and that should be really confusing and make it hard to follow. But the story makes that sacrifice because it's prioritizing how things are laid out on the page. The tight panel of Kuma, tight so we get the feeling that he's not focusing on what's around him, has him looking to the right, directly at Ivankov, while the panel to the left has Saturn on the right edge of it, meaning that Kuma isn't looking at Saturn. So this conveys the feeling that Kuma is looking back at his friend instead of paying attention to what's in front of him just through the panel layout without even needing to have a wide shot that gives us the full physical positions in world. We are also continuing to use the imagery of how Saturn's attack works that we were using in the present day sequences. The invisible attack along his eye line and someone spinning backwards like this with their line of action backwards. It's because we established this imagery before that we can intuitively understand it here. If we just got this panel and never saw Saturn attack before, this probably would be confusing. But when we establish how it works in a purely visual way, that means that we can then use that visual again without needing any further explanations. Check out my video on that chapter for a further explanation of how this whole thing worked. The next page is my favorite in the entire chapter. Kuma gives his speech about rejecting slavery, about saving people, about being free, and the inspiration Nika gives him for that. And almost every panel on this page ties into that using height. Kuma is on the ground below Saturn. Saturn is in the upper half of his panels, looking down. Kuma is in the lower half, but despite being in the lower half, he's looking up. Their entire dynamic is consistently using height to convey hierarchy, but Kuma isn't looking down. He doesn't have his eyes on the ground in subservience. He is looking up, challenging those above him. Something like this could be conveyed in some big, wide, double-page spread that has somebody way above and somebody way below, and that would be really impactful as well, but it's not the only way to use the visual aspect of manga to convey ideas. I think it's just as impressive to take an ordinary sequence, an ordinary conversation full of different panels from different angles, but in a bunch of different ways, keep conveying that same feeling of height, to incorporate that framing into the feeling of the conversation. Paneling isn't just about what you notice, it's about what you don't notice that conveys ideas. We end the chapter on Kuma and Ginny finally living their lives again. What I love about this page is how it emphasizes both their differences and their similarities. The first panel makes their relative sizes very apparent, and it follows up on that by showing how badly Ginny needs to eat, countering what you would expect from their sizes. We then set up an emotional release by establishing Ginny looking away from Kuma with this divide between them so that we can get this turning around motion of her looking back at him. And I love these two panels because they contradict all the differences between them that we just showed. Sure, physically, they might be very different sizes, but when we're focusing on the emotions, they get panels of the exact same size and they get expressions of the exact same size. Because despite their differences, they are equal in this. They are equal in what they feel. They feel the same depth of emotion, and this unites them. It makes them one. And I'm not sure I can think of a better example than that for the power of paneling and how it tells a story. Now, I'd like to end off this discussion with a question for all of you. I think it's fairly apparent that Oda will use the shape of an island to symbolize an idea. The pirate island Hachinosu is literally shaped like a skull, and yet I can't figure out what exactly the shape of God Valley symbolizes. Maybe it's just to be a memorable shape so we know where we're cutting to, but I feel like there's gotta be more. Do the two peaks symbolize a kind of duality? Does the break in the island symbolize some kind of vulnerability or some kind of emptiness? There are ideas of vulnerability and how they were vulnerable to the world government attacking them, but I can't quite find the right angle of how that idea lines up. Maybe there are further secrets to the island's past that we'll figure out in another flashback. Maybe this hole is here because somebody literally cleaved it in an attack in the past. I'm not sure, but I want to hear your ideas on what the shape of the island might mean. If you have an idea on that, or any other things about the paneling in this chapter that I missed and you want to point out, feel free to comment. If you have any suggestions for past chapters you want me to cover, feel free to comment that as well. I make these videos every week, so if you want to see more of them, subscribe. And if you love food as much as Ginny does, then give the video a like. Follow me on Twitter for updates on this and other takes on One Piece, and have a happy Halloween!